A black mother was humiliated by a white doctor who didn't know her son was the hospital's main investor. This moment changed everything for both of them, sparking a chain of events that shook everyone. My response will surprise even the most jaded. But let's start from the beginning. Ellen Robinson, a 68-year-old black woman, quietly entered the emergency room of the prestigious St. Mary's General Hospital. She felt slightly weak, her heart beating faster than usual, and a dull pain in her chest made her glance around nervously. The hospital gleamed with sterile cleanliness, appearing like a place where people were supposed to receive the best care. However, Ellen was not sure she would be welcomed with open arms here. She nervously looked at the reception desk. A young white woman behind the computer glanced at her indifferently, but managed to force a routine smile. Ellen, in a soft voice, explained that she needed an examination, as she had been feeling extreme fatigue and chest pain for the past few days. The administrator coolly nodded and pointed to a chair where Ellen had to wait her turn. Hour after hour passed, and Ellen was feeling worse. She noticed how other patients who arrived after her were seen much quicker. One patient, a white man in a business suit, breezed through the doctor's door without waiting, while Ellen was left to sit. She bit her lips, trying to ignore it, but waves of injustice were rising within her. Finally, her name was called loudly through the microphone. Slowly, Ellen rose from her chair and headed toward the doctor's office. The doctor was William Greaves, a tall, imposing man with graying temples and a cold, condescending expression. He stood by his desk, not even offering her a seat. His face showed clear weariness, as if he had seen this scene countless times, and didn't plan to spend much time on her. "What's wrong with you?" he asked indifferently, without even looking at her. Ellen tried to explain her symptoms: dizziness, chest pain, constant fatigue. But as soon as she began speaking, Greaves interrupted her, skeptically looking her up and down. "We have high standards here," he said coldly, staring at her. "Are you sure you can afford treatment at this facility?" Those words cut her like a knife. Ellen didn't immediately find the strength to respond. Her heart ached more intensely, but gathering her resolve, she quietly and confidently replied, "Yes, doctor, I can afford it." The doctor merely scoffed, jotting something down in his papers without bothering to check her symptoms for even a second. He added dryly, "I think it would be better for you to visit a local clinic. They can provide more affordable care there." Ellen felt her face burn with humiliation. The doctor hadn't even glanced at her medical record or asked any questions about her condition. He had simply assumed she couldn't pay for the treatment. Biting her lip and holding back tears, she quietly nodded and left the office. Ellen slowly exited the doctor's office, feeling her legs turn to jelly from exhaustion and disappointment. In the hospital lobby, she paused briefly to compose herself before heading outside. The warm autumn breeze brushed her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number of her son, Marcus Robinson. Marcus had always been her pride. Growing up in a world where they were treated with disdain and bias, he had risen through life despite all the obstacles. Ellen knew he had become a successful businessman, though he didn't tell her all the details of his career, preferring to protect her from unnecessary worries. He was busy managing multiple large investments and frequently traveled for work. She didn't want to bother him, but right now, she needed his voice, his support. Marcus answered almost immediately, his deep, confident voice soothing her a bit. "Hi, Mom. How are you? Everything okay?" he asked with slight concern, sensing that his mother wouldn't call without reason. Ellen tried to speak calmly, but her voice trembled with the humiliation she had just endured. "I was just at the hospital," she began. "I haven't been feeling well, so I decided to go in. But—" She paused, fighting back a surge of emotion. "The doctor refused to properly examine me. He just said I wouldn't be able to afford the treatment." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Marcus froze. His face tensed as he realized that his mother had just been subjected to blatant discrimination. It was a blow not only to her, but also to their family, to everything he had worked so hard to build. "Mom, can you get home safely?" Marcus asked, trying to suppress his rising anger. "Yes, I'm almost home, she replied, trying to reassure him. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. But Marcus couldn't stop worrying. His hands clenched into fists as he realized that his mother had suffered from the bias treatment in the very hospital where he had recently invested significant funds. Just a few months ago, he had become one of the largest investors in this medical facility with the goal of improving healthcare for everyone, regardless of their race or social standing. I can't let this slide, he said, barely containing his rage. Mom, we're going back there. I'll go with you. Ellen was surprised by his tone. She knew her son wasn't one to make idle threats. Marcus was always a man of action, and once he decided something, he never backed down. Are you sure you want to go back? She asked cautiously. Yes, I'm sure. We need to deal with this, Marcus firmly replied. I'll be at your house in half an hour. After ending the call, Marcus quickly began taking action. He dialed several numbers, contacting people who worked at the hospital and informed them of his upcoming visit. But he intentionally withheld details about the incident. He wanted this moment to be a surprise for everyone, especially Dr. Greaves. About 40 minutes later, they stood before the hospital doors. Ellen felt uncertain, but Marcus was resolute. He knew this visit would mark the beginning of change. As Marcus and his mother walked down the long corridor of the hospital, Ellen couldn't shake her feeling of anxiety. She saw the determination in her son's eyes, the same determination he had shown whenever faced with injustice. But she didn't know all the details of his life over the past few years. Reflecting on his childhood, she swelled with pride at the man he had become. Marcus had grown up in a rough neighborhood, where their family had constantly faced racial discrimination. As a teenager, he often witnessed how the police stopped him for no other reason than the color of his skin. He saw friends become victims of bias at school, in the streets, and at work. But Marcus had always been different from his peers, relentless in his pursuit to change his life. After high school, he managed to get into university despite all the difficulties and financial limitations. There, he quickly realized that education and financial independence were the keys to success. His motivation wasn't just to escape poverty, but to help his mother, who had worked herself to the bone, to give him a chance at a better future. Marcus thrived in business. His primary focus was investments in real estate and tech startups. He founded his own company, which eventually became one of the leading firms in its field. Despite his success, Marcus never forgot where he came from. He continuously gave back to his community, investing in education programs and charitable causes. When Marcus had the chance to invest in healthcare, he jumped at the opportunity. He had recently invested a significant sum in St. Mary's General Hospital, believing that improving healthcare access for all, especially for those who traditionally faced barriers, was a critical step toward justice. For him, it wasn't just a business investment, it was personal. And now, standing beside his mother in this very hospital, Marcus understood that his efforts and money might have been in vain if doctors like Dr. Greaves continued to practice discrimination. His anger grew with each passing second, but he knew he had to stay calm. A battle lay ahead, and he was ready. Ellen noticed how her son was breathing steadily, trying not to let his emotions show. Her heart ached, not just from her physical ailment, but from the realization that her son, despite all his achievements, was once again forced to fight the same injustice they had faced their entire lives. Mom, Marcus said, looking at her, I know how hard this might be for you, but today we're not leaving until we get justice. Ellen nodded, sensing that her son had taken on the role of protector, determined to confront the barriers in their path. Her own pain no longer seemed as important. What mattered now was that her son stood strong against the injustice they had both encountered. As Marcus and Ellen approached the reception desk, Marcus walked with purpose, his presence commanding attention. Ellen remained slightly behind him, nervous but trusting in her son's determination. When they reached the receptionist, Marcus spoke politely but firmly. We want to meet with Dr. Greaves again. He recently refused to examine my mother properly, and I'd like to discuss it with him personally. The woman at the desk, who had seen them earlier, looked up and met his gaze. There was a flicker of confusion in her eyes, followed by nervousness. Marcus noticed how her demeanor shifted, now much more cautious than during their first visit. "Dr. Greaves is busy at the moment," she began, but Marcus cut her off before she could finish. "I'm not asking," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We will see him. Immediately." The woman hesitated for a moment, but sensing his unyielding confidence and determination, she nodded and dialed a number on the phone. After a brief conversation, she gestured toward the familiar office. Ellen felt uneasy, aware of the quick glances from hospital staff as they walked by. But Marcus remained composed, focused, each step bringing them closer to the doctor's office. When they entered, they found Dr. Greaves standing behind his desk, flipping through some documents. The doctor looked up and, upon seeing them, frowned. He clearly hadn't expected them to return, let alone with Marcus by her side. His irritation was visible. "You're back?" he asked, his tone cold, but now tinged with surprise. "Yes, we're back," Marcus replied calmly, taking a step forward. "My mother, Ellen Robinson, came to you seeking help, and you dismissed her, based on your prejudiced assumptions. I've come to discuss why you thought that was acceptable." Dr. Greaves sneered slightly, unwilling to back down from his usual demeanor. For him, this was a simple situation. Another patient he deemed unworthy of his time or care. "We have high standards here," he began with a shrug, as if trying to defend himself. "Sometimes we have to prioritize those who can get more qualified care." Marcus paused, staring straight into the doctor's eyes. He knew that this moment would be pivotal. "Let me enlighten you, doctor," Marcus continued, his voice steady but carrying an underlying threat. "I'm not just the son of the patient you dismissed and humiliated. I am one of the largest investors in this hospital. It's because of my money and connections that this place operates at the level you so proudly boast about. And now, you stand before the man who can decide not only the fate of this hospital, but also your career." Dr. Greaves froze. His face quickly changed. His arrogance melted into fear. He stared at Marcus, processing what had just been said. He slowly realized the gravity of the situation he had landed himself in. "What did you say?" the doctor croaked, trying to recover. You're an investor?" Marcus held the doctor's gaze, giving him a moment to fully grasp the seriousness of his predicament. "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "I'm one of the largest investors in this hospital. My name is Marcus Robinson, and I invested significant funds to ensure that people like my mother could receive quality medical care, regardless of their social status or race. And you, doctor, with your arrogance and bias, have undermined everything I've worked for." This time, Dr. Greaves had no reply. His face turned pale, and panic flickered in his eyes. He glanced around the office, as if searching for an escape from the uncomfortable situation, but there was no way out. His career and reputation now hung by a thread. I didn't know," he stammered, lowering his gaze as if searching for an excuse. "I couldn't have known that." "You couldn't have known that a black woman deserves respectful treatment?" Marcus cut him off sharply, stepping forward. "Is that what you're trying to say? You didn't need to know who I was or who my mother was. Your job is to treat patients, regardless of where they come from. Instead, you judged her based on her appearance and denied her the care she needed." Those words, spoken with icy justice, made the doctor sink into his chair. He hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. His arrogance was now completely gone, replaced by the realization that his actions had severe consequences. "Listen, Mr. Robinson," the doctor began, trying to find a way out. "I deeply regret what happened. Perhaps I was too harsh. But please understand, we have a lot of patients and—" Marcus cut him off again, this time with a cold, unyielding tone. "What I understand is this. People like you are the reason why individuals like my mother continue to suffer from systemic racism, and that is unacceptable. I don't just want an apology. I want this never to happen again, to my mother or to anyone else." Dr. Greaves stared at Marcus, fully aware now that apologies or excuses were no longer enough. Marcus spoke with such authority and power that the doctor realized his career at this hospital was likely over. "I understand," the doctor finally muttered. "I'll apologize and face the consequences." But Marcus was no longer interested in the conversation. He took a step back and looked at his mother. Ellen, who had been silently holding back her emotions throughout the confrontation, finally felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. "Let's go, Mom," Marcus said gently, his voice once again soft and caring. "We've done what we needed to do. Now it's time for change at this hospital." As they turned to leave, Dr. Greaves remained seated in silence, coming to terms with the fact that everything he knew and had taken for granted was now crumbling before his eyes. Dr. William Greaves sat frozen at his desk, stunned by the recent events. His hands, once steady and confident, now trembled slightly. He couldn't believe he was at the center of such a scandal. For his entire career, Greaves had considered himself a competent professional, confident in his methods, never thinking that his behavior might be seen as biased or even racist. But the words Marcus Robinson had delivered with cold certainty had shattered this illusion. Each of Marcus's statements echoed in his mind like thunderclaps. Greaves couldn't shake the image of Ellen Robinson's quiet, dignified face when he had so easily dismissed her. She was just another patient to him, one of many he saw every day, but now it seemed that her presence would be etched in his memory forever. Greaves understood that all his career achievements and titles wouldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Almost mechanically, he opened his laptop and began searching for information about Marcus Robinson. His heart sank as he saw articles about Marcus's accomplishments in business and his work in the community. This was a man who had spent his life fighting for the rights of those suffering from systemic injustice. Greaves realized he had encountered a force that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. But what stung even more was the realization that his own unconscious prejudices, which he had considered harmless, had now become a threat not only to his reputation, but to the hospital itself. He closed the laptop and covered his face with his hands. The realization that his entire career could be over because of one wrong decision struck at his ego. But even more painful was the growing understanding that he was, in fact, guilty. For the first time in years, Dr. Greaves began questioning how many patients he had dismissed simply because they didn't fit his idea of worthy patients. Greaves thought back to his childhood and upbringing. He had grown up in a conservative family where many beliefs about life and people were instilled from an early age. Over the years, these beliefs had solidified, and he never considered how they might distort his perception of others. In medical school, he had focused on his career, on gaining knowledge, but never considered the importance of understanding patients, not just as subjects for treatment, but as human beings with stories, struggles, and dignity. That night was long for him. He revisited his old notes, reread medical articles, but couldn't focus. His thoughts kept returning to Ellen and Marcus. Their visit had forced him to confront a reality he had long ignored, that his professionalism, which he had been so proud of, was tainted by deep-rooted prejudices he hadn't even known existed. Greaves had always believed he was free from bias, but the truth was different. The next morning, Greaves arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, but representatives from the administration were already there waiting for him. He was informed that he had been temporarily suspended from his duties pending an internal investigation. It was the first real blow to his career in all the years he had worked. In the eyes of his colleagues, he saw a mix of pity and judgment. But what hurt his pride even more was the realization that all this was a result of his own actions. As he left the hospital, his gaze fell on the patients in the waiting room. There were people from all walks of life, young and old, white and black, wealthy and poor. And only now did he begin to understand that every single one of them deserved the same level of respect and professional care. This lesson, bitter as it was, had transformed his view, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his profession and life. Dr. Greaves walked out of the hospital, realizing that an internal transformation was now ahead of him, a much harder battle than anything he had faced before. A few weeks after the incident with Dr. Greaves, significant changes took place at St. Mary's General Hospital. The hospital's leadership took Marcus Robinson's demands seriously, understanding that situations like this could no longer go unpunished. A mandatory racial and social sensitivity training program for all hospital staff was immediately launched. Marcus personally oversaw the reforms to ensure that cases of discrimination would never happen again. For Ellen Robinson, this was a special moment. She returned to the hospital, but this time she received the medical attention she needed. A new doctor examined her, one who was polite, attentive, and caring. Ellen felt more comfortable, although the chest pain still worried her. But now, she didn't have to fight for her right to medical treatment. It was provided with respect and care, just as it should have been from the start. Marcus accompanied her to the follow-up appointment, though without the tension that had surrounded their first visit. He sat in the waiting room, reflecting on how important this step was. His influence, his efforts, were finally making an impact. He had always believed that fighting for justice was not just the responsibility of individuals, but required systemic change from within. "Thank you, Marcus," Ellen said as they left the hospital after her checkup. "You've accomplished what many thought was impossible." He looked at his mother warmly and smiled slightly. "It wasn't just for you, Mom," he replied softly. "It's for everyone who's ever had to go through what you did. The system can be changed, but it takes time and persistence. We've taken the first step, but there's still a long way to go." Dr. Greaves no longer worked at the hospital. His temporary suspension had turned into a permanent dismissal. It wasn't just the administration's decision, but also the result of his own realization that he could no longer work with the same confidence. After several conversations with hospital representatives and human rights organizations, Greaves had submitted his resignation. He wasn't completely broken, but he understood that his former path in medicine had come to an end. Now, he was looking for ways to change himself, possibly working with communities where he could atone for his mistakes. For Marcus and Ellen, the story didn't end with the firing of one doctor. Marcus continued to invest in the hospital, expanding programs that helped people like his mother receive quality health care. He pushed for the creation of a fund to support low-income patients and for initiatives aimed at combating racial prejudice in healthcare. The public's response to the case was overwhelmingly positive. The story of Marcus and Ellen became known not only within their community, but far beyond. The media picked up the story, turning it into an example of how one person can change the system. Many people who had previously suffered in silence from injustice began to speak out. For Ellen, this was a moral victory. She had always believed in her son and knew that his determination and strength would bring about change. Now, she felt that her experience had become part of a broader struggle for justice. She knew that many Black women like herself still faced biased treatment, but now they had hoped that the world was beginning to change. As they walked away from the hospital, heading home, Marcus knew there was still much work to be done. For him, this was only the beginning. He was determined to keep fighting to change the system, and to fight for justice not just in St. Mary's, but in every corner where discrimination still lingered. Dr. William Greaves sat in his office, haunted by the events that had unfolded in the past weeks. His hands, once so steady and certain, trembled as he replayed Marcus Robinson's words over and over in his mind. His self-assured confidence as a seasoned professional had been shattered by the realization of how deeply his own biases had influenced his decisions. He was used to seeing patients come and go, but the image of Ellen Robinson, the quiet, respectful woman he had dismissed so easily, remained fixed in his thoughts. For years, Greaves had prided himself on being a capable doctor, someone who made tough calls every day. But now, he saw those decisions in a different light. How many other patients had he overlooked? How many times had he let his assumptions guide his treatment? His confidence was gone, replaced by doubt, shame, and regret. As he faced the consequences of his actions, he realized this was the hardest lesson of his career. Weeks had passed since the confrontation at St. Mary's General Hospital, and the changes Marcus Robinson had demanded were already starting to take shape. The hospital's leadership, recognizing the gravity of the situation, had moved swiftly. Mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all hospital staff had become a top priority, and a clear message was sent that discrimination of any kind would no longer be tolerated. For Ellen Robinson, this transformation felt like both a personal and communal victory. She returned to the hospital for another checkup, but this time under very different circumstances. Her new doctor, attentive and respectful, provided the care she needed. She no longer had to question whether she would be treated with the dignity she deserved. The hospital staff's attitudes had noticeably shifted, and Ellen felt a newfound sense of respect in the air. As Marcus sat with his mother in the waiting room, he reflected on the impact of their actions. What had begun as a painful personal experience had become a catalyst for change, not just for Ellen, but for all patients who might have faced similar discrimination in the future. He realized that systemic change starts with moments like these, where individuals stand up against injustice and force institutions to reflect on their own practices. "You did something remarkable, Marcus," Ellen said, her voice filled with pride as they left the hospital. "You stood up for me, but it's so much more than that." Marcus smiled at his mother, his expression softening. "I did what needed to be done, Mom," he replied. "This isn't just about you or me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what you did. Change has to start somewhere, and I'm glad we could be a part of it." The changes Marcus had pushed for were making waves beyond the hospital. Word of what had happened between him and Dr. Greaves had spread, and the story was picked up by local and national media. It became a symbol of the fight against systemic racism in healthcare, and Marcus's role as a major investor added weight to the narrative. Communities that had long suffered from healthcare disparities saw hope in this case, a powerful reminder that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged and reformed. Dr. William Greaves, however, was now facing the full consequences of his actions. His temporary suspension from the hospital had turned into a permanent termination. The internal investigation conducted by the hospital had revealed more instances where Greaves's judgment had been influenced by unconscious bias. Realizing that his position was untenable, Greaves chose to resign rather than be officially dismissed. For him, this marked the end of a long career, but also the beginning of a painful self-reflection. Greaves had begun seeking counseling and participating in workshops focused on addressing personal and institutional biases. He understood now that he had a long way to go in unlearning the prejudices he had unknowingly internalized over the years. Though his career as a doctor was over, he hoped that by working with organizations focused on racial equality, he might atone for the mistakes of his past and help prevent others from making the same errors. For Marcus, though Dr. Greaves's resignation felt like justice, he knew that the fight wasn't over. His commitment to reforming the hospital didn't stop at one doctor. He continued to advocate for systemic changes, such as creating a dedicated fund for low-income patients and implementing ongoing diversity and inclusion programs. He worked closely with the hospital board to ensure that racial sensitivity training would become a permanent part of the institution's culture. The impact of Marcus's actions rippled far beyond the walls of St. Mary's General. His story inspired other institutions to take a closer look at their own practices, sparking conversations about healthcare inequality across the country. In community forums, people who had previously felt silenced began sharing their own experiences of discrimination in medical settings. Marcus became a sought-after speaker at conferences and workshops focused on addressing racial bias in healthcare, using his influence to promote equality and fairness in the system. For Ellen, the experience had been transformative in more ways than one. While her physical health had been the initial concern, the journey she and Marcus had taken together had healed a deeper, emotional wound. For years, she had quietly endured the subtle and overt prejudices of a society that often overlooked women like her. But now, she felt empowered by her son's strength and the changes they had sparked. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus," Ellen said as they walked toward their car after another hospital visit. "You've turned something painful into something powerful." "It's just the beginning, Mom," Marcus replied. "There's so much more we can do. But this is a good start."